never held a spear in his life. Maybe if he'd never picked up that first spear, none of this would have happened.
Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for The Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 26 of The Storming Journey, where we're going to be discussing Way of Kings, chapter 27, Chasm Duty. I'm Adam, and I am today's Ardent.
I'm Liz, and I'll be your Worldsinger today.
And I'm Elle, the Veristitalian.
Okay, so we're looking at this chapter through the theme of honesty, and rather than share a time when I either was or wasn't honest and bad results from it, I wanted to share kind of a recurring situation in my life that I struggle with. Being someone who loves reading and also loves writing, I have a lot of friends now who have written or published books. And I also read a lot of books, and I write reviews for them on Goodreads. And the dilemma that faces me many, many times is what to do when reviewing a book that is written by a friend. Because, of course, I want to support my friends by reviewing their books and giving them, the +1 on Goodreads. But the struggle is I don't always love the books written by my friends. So then I have to ask myself, what do I do? If I have read a book by a friend and perhaps they know that I am reading their book, and then what do I say in the review? How honest should I be? Do I say who I thought the book was for and give a nice summary and just leave implied that I am not saying anything about how I felt about this book? Do I give it a star rating? Do I not give it a star rating? Do I be totally honest with what I think about the book and then, deal with the fallout from my friend? It's also different if I read the book before it's published versus after. I've been asked to review manuscripts from friends, and I am a very blunt reviewer, and that doesn't always turn out well if the person is not expecting that kind of review. So this is something I've struggled with over time. When to be honest with critical feedback or critical reactions to things, when to preserve the relationship versus providing other readers with more information about the book. So there you go. This is my struggle with one social situation of honesty.
I am not regularly in this situation, but I tend to be in the camp of reviews are for the readers, not for the authors.
And so am I most of the time. But then it feels really weird when you are writing about your friend's book that, I don't think this book was well written, and they're going to read it because there's only 10 reviews of this book.
I also face that same dilemma many, many times. I am more in the camp myself of just every book deserves 5 stars because it's a book that's been written and published, except for when I'm paid to edit. That's what I'm always unless I also am critiquing it. But that's my own honesty. That's why I don't do Goodreads or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm not in those situations. All right, I have today's Storm's Eye View. Kaladin presents knobweed sap gathered in the dead of night. If wild knobweed reeds aren't effective, why did they work? With a skymark in hand, Kaladin considers leaving the war camps. Instead, he returns to Gaz, ordering him to chasm duty. Kaladin refuses to take any responsibility for Gaz's punishing decisions. Tension is broken in the chasms by Dunny's youthful singing. It rises again when Kaladin picks up a scavenged spear. Ignoring the jeers, he performs a showy kata. They're amazed. While they loot bodies, they discover the Parshendi's body armor. Rock's stew gives them an opportunity for the needed camaraderie. Though I'm realizing that the way I wrote that, there is a weird disconnect between the last 2 sentences there, but that's okay.
It's a storm's eye view. There's some storm happening, and maybe you had to turn around from that, or the storm father wasn't with you for that sentence. I don't know. So I picked the theme of honesty as chapter for chasm duty. I wanted us to focus and think through 4 different areas with honesty in the chapter. We can go to other areas if y'all saw other areas for honesty, but I first got this idea for the theme when I was doing the pre-reading, and there was a conversation around the knobweed sap. So I'd love to just follow the chapter chronologically and discuss like the knobweed sap encounter where the apothecary is not being honest, the Kaladin's not always being honest to the apothecary, and the tension between that. And then think about Kaladin and his honesty as well, him being honest to himself at this point in the narrative and his desires, and also him being honest to his fellow bridge crew members. Syl is a Windspren, and her honesty to the truth of not really being a Windspren and actually being an honor spren, and asking this question of like, can you be honest to something if you don't know the truth of it? And then finally thinking about the opening quote where it came to what if you'd never picked it up, and thinking about when was that first spear pickup that happened in Kaladin's past, because I think it's probably happened in the flashback so far, but I want to think if there's like multiple things that we can get across with that sentence. That's roughly the outline that I was thinking of for the chapter. Okay, so let's jump into the knobweed sap then. So this interaction with the apothecary to catch us up in the narrative, right? Kaladin's gone and gathered knobweed sap. The apothecary said you can't really do that, and it's very expensive, but he's been able to do it, and so he brings a jar of knobweed sap to the medicine man in the war camp, and they have this like tense battle over what the knobweed sap is and if it's good and if it's not. Where did we see honesty there? What type of ideas of honesty did y'all pull out from that section?
I really like the quote that Kaladin has after when he's discussing this conversation with Syl, where he says, it's not dishonest, it's business, which is really fascinating because like it very much is dishonest, and that doesn't like it being business and the way that things are normally done doesn't make it less dishonest. And it felt very relevant to the current day of like in general capitalism and pricing of things feeling dishonest. Like I do understand that there are reasons why prices should go up or can go up for things, but like also, I feel like there are other times where like people are getting together and deciding the prices of things should be higher, and like it hurts the average person, and they don't have enough information to say, wait, we're not willing to be okay with this, and they don't have any way to interfere in that. And even Kaladin, like he hates the fact that the apothecaries are a cartel with like knobweed sap, but he's like, but there's nothing I can do about that. I can't change it. I understand why they're doing it, so I'm just going to work within the system I have. I hate it. I hate it so much. Every once in a while I'm driving home from something and I'm like, man, I really hate profit maximization, which is just not a thing I didn't think I'd think about that as an adult. Like that's not the worries I thought I would have.
I want to push back a little bit, because are the apothecaries a cartel or are they a union? Because, right, they've gotten together and said, we're all going to charge the same price. And it feels like they're a cartel because we're in Kaladin's perspective and he can't afford these prices. But as the apothecary points out, the high princes can, and they're the ones who are the main customer, right? And so they're saying, it costs us a lot to set up shop here, but our products are actually pretty cheap. We could easily be undercut if, non-union apothecaries came in and undersold us like Kaladin could right now. So what's the difference between profit maximizing and like protectionism and making sure that the apothecaries are making a living wage? Are they making an exorbitant profit? I don't know. I don't know that we have enough evidence to determine that.
I think it would feel different if he was willing to pay Kaladin differently. Like, if it was reflective of the circumstances. Because if they're saying, oh, we charge that much because the high princes can charge that much, then they should be charging Kaladin within his budget. And they're not saying, okay, so like half a clear mark or whatever for this knobweed sap because that's within your cost range. And so that's why, like, I mean, maybe it is union. I don't know enough about business or unions or any of that, or cartels, quite frankly. But like, I think it would feel better as someone in Kaladin's shoes, or like being on Kaladin's perspective, if that was the like consideration. So it feels like a cartel for now.
I'm being a little facetious with this, but like I've just been listening to a Freakonomics episode about self-driving cars and taxis, right? And taxis were basically unaffordable to people. And that's why Uber and Lyft were able to get into the market, is because they had unionized and set the prices so high that the average person is not going to pay them. Only business people are going to pay them because they can charge to the business account, right? And that's kind of the situation that the apothecaries feel like, is that they've priced out Kaladin, right? But they're also ensuring that they have enough money to set up shop. He gestures to, like, we have overhead expenses, etc. So, yeah, I am being a little facetious because, yeah, I do find it annoying when industries fix prices. But on the other hand, what is a union but price fixing for the benefit of the worker?
I think about when I was getting into editing and like freelance editing, and I had this tension in myself because it's like, I have to, if I was a full-time freelancer, I'd have to earn X amount of money. But if someone's just a part-time freelancer and they have like a husband who can take care of all of the household expenses, I have to charge more than that other person. And it's something I always get very upset with, especially around the editing world in Utah, because a lot of editors in Utah charge only like 1 cent a word when the going rate is 2 to 3 cents a word. And I compare myself to, like, now I live in the East and my rent is like $2,000 a month rather than $400 or $500 a month, like it was when I lived in Utah. And like, there's that sense as well of the price fixing. But I wanted to pull out, maybe not a conversation of unions, which we can say here, we support unions from this podcast, especially if they're good unions. There are bad ones out there, but I think there's like layers to honesty and perspective to honesty there, right? The tension between your facetiousness with unions and Elle's like gut reaction to be on Kaladin's side, like, shows that like honesty is always dependent upon perspective. When it comes to like really seeing like when to be honest and where to be honest and how to be honest. Because I think like there's a tension then on that where it's like, can't you just always be honest according to the truth? Or do you have to be honest according to sometimes the perspective that you're taking, right? And those different like layers to honesty that are coming out in that tension that both of you are pointing out is really interesting, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Unintentional Mormon moment here. When I was younger, I was taught a singular version of the first vision. And
briefly, Elle, can you explain what the first vision is to our non-Mormon listeners?
The first vision is an experience that Joseph Smith had where he said that he saw Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ and that they appeared to him when he was 14 in a grove of trees in upstate New York. So when I was growing up, it was, okay, here's a single version of the first vision. It's provided in the LDS scriptures that most LDS members have. And then there were 4 accounts that were eventually like widely released. And these had been around for a really long time. But they all had different ways of telling the story. And for some people, this really bothered them, that like there are these different versions of the stories. And so like, how can we know which one of them is true? Because all of them say different things. All of them say that Christ and Heavenly Father said different things. And so like, well, if none of them, like, can all of them be true? Are none of them true? But why I never personally have a problem with it was because they were all told to different audiences at different times for different reasons. And so there were different elements that were highlighted in telling the story. And I had done that myself in like telling various stories about my life. I highlight different things at different times to different audiences. I might tell somebody, oh, I had this thought but it was a very personal thought, and so I don't tell very many people that. But I might tell it in a very intimate setting where I trust the person. And so there are all these different stories, and all of them are true in the way that they need to be true to tell that story to that particular audience. And so I think like there isn't actually often an objective truth. There's a truth that's appropriate for the situation, for the context, and you can't always give that full truth because of whatever is going on. And that doesn't make you a liar for not giving the full truth. It's a different truth.
And I think that kind of leads into your second point of your outline, Adam, that like we have Kaladin struggling to be honest with himself about his past and like whether he wants to reveal the details of his past to the other bridgemen, whether he wants to, you know, explain what he means when he says, "Oh, I've tried defeating a shard bearer before." I'm just gonna leave that comment there, mic drop. I'm not gonna explain it. Is that dishonest of him not to provide that information, or is that him guarding his privacy, or like deciding that like we're not close enough for me to share this with you, or I'm worried about the repercussions of sharing that with you, and so I'm not going to share that information with you, even though it's true?
Well, there's also like that question of like, can we ever be fully honest with other people? Can Kaladin ever share everything? I think about like, I love that we don't know everything about Kaladin, like that random girlfriend that he had. It's always going to be a mystery. I forget what her name is.
I'm pretty sure it's Tara.
Tara?
I think it was Tara.
She has to be a world hopper because Tara is not a Rosharan name. I'm just going to put that out there. Tara as Hoyd, but in drag. Anyway, that fan fiction will be written one day, I'm sure. Hoyd's lived for a while. You get bored. But anyway.
Yeah, let's not get too sidetracked on Tara.
Justice for Tara. I think like that question. So like the question that I was going for is like throughout the narrative is Kaladin being honest with himself and with others. Because I think a lot of the narrative, he's actually dishonest with himself and dishonest with who he is. And I think that kind of rings true across everything that a human does, though. Like we're always dishonest to ourselves. We always tell ourselves we can do something when we can't really do it, right? Until we prove ourselves to do it. And I think there's this tension of honesty that lies at the core of his interactions with the bridge crew, his bridge crew in this chapter, right? Where he just like has that hint that you brought up, or he is very guarded about himself. But then it asks the question of like, in being dishonest to other people, is he also dishonest to who he is, which is a spear, a kick-ass spear warrior person who actually leads and who, I mean, he's trying to lead here, but like at the same time, he's being a little bit coy about it. He's being a little bit furtive about it. He's being a little bit guarded about it, which I just think is interesting that like, even though he's doing all these really good things, he's doing them in very dishonest ways. If you're reading it through that way.
It was Tara. I just forgot the H at the end when I looked it up in Coppermind. She's not on Kaladin's page.
Justice for Tara, Coppermind people. Justice for Tara.
It is a wiki, Elle. You can solve this problem.
I did actually find her on the page, but it's like in a weird spot. So she mentioned once. It's fine. We're good. Justice still for Tara.
So I think like a question we can move on from the Terra sidetrack would be, what would an honest Kaladin look like? So here thinking through like the counterfactual of the chapter, because I think we can kind of agree that Kaladin's been a little, he's not completely honest. I don't think he's proactively dishonest. He's just, as Liz was saying, guarding some of his personal history. So what would like a completely honest Kaladin look like in relation to him interacting with the bridge crew? What do we think that would look like if he's gone through all the PTSD, processed the trauma? There's a little therapist in the war camp and has helped him work through everything. He's not an enslaved human being either. It's like to remove all those like constraints. What do we think that would look like?
I don't think he could exist like without all of the constraints are putting him where he is. Like even if we say, okay, he's still enslaved as a bridgeman, like an honest Kaladin might say, hey, I have this training as a soldier. I have helped people escape before. If this is something we are willing to do, I think we could make it work. But that requires a level of trust in all the other bridgemen to not turn them in, which could end up being a reward, like for rewarding the snitching, I guess. But also, like, I don't know that Kaladin being honest here is even within the like realm of his character right now. Like, there's not a way for current Kaladin, even with, I don't know, some level of therapy, to be honest. And I think, like, that's because of his situation. Like, I don't think there's a way to disconnect the situation and what he's doing from his honesty or lack thereof.
I wonder also if part of Kaladin's reticence is because part of what got him into this situation, it was being too honest with Amaram about how he felt about the shard plate. If Kaladin had been more willing to flatter Amaram and be like, oh no, I could never take the shard plate. I think it belongs to you. Like, maybe he could have avoided the whole thing. But instead, he's very honest about how he feels about Amaram and about what has happened to his men. And Amaram doesn't react well to that. And obviously, Amaram bears the lion's share of the blame here. But I think Kaladin has been burned by honesty and is worried about sharing his innermost thoughts with people because it didn't turn out well.
Well, I think both of those, like, pull out a truth about honesty, right? That, like, it is always circumstantial. And I think that's something hard to fully swallow, right? When we're always told, be the most honest person you can be. What are kids told growing up, right? Be honest to adults. Tell them the truth. Don't lie about that little candy bar you stole or something like that, right? And so I think in a very more mature way, honesty, like, requires awareness of what's happening around you. Because I love that, pulling that out, that Kaladin's being too honest, it led it to various things, right? Being too honest about his desire for the spear, for example, led him to sign up into the army in many ways. Him being too honest about, like, not wanting to be a doctor in some ways, or being too honest with Amaran, to get to this point where he's very cold and dark and depressed, right? Which for most of Way of Kings, that's you see brief lights, brief little flashes of good Kaladin, but, like, he does very crumpled person by this point, and he stays a crumpled person for a very long time. Go Kaladin of Rhythm of War and his grumpiness, grumpy Cali boy from good old Rhythm. But I think, like, both of your comments are pulling on that idea of it being circumstantial, which I think, like, guides us a little bit into that final question that I had with Kaladin. Like, how does one be honest when you are enslaved? How does one be honest when you have all of these things happening around you? Or can you be honest in those cases even?
Well, I think I keep thinking about the common, like, philosophical, like, thought exercise of, like, if someone comes to your door looking for someone that you are hiding, and you know that if you turn them over that they will be hurt, do you be honest and turn them over? And, like, most people's reaction is to say, well, no, like, I would lie and say that they're not here or whatever. The way we often talk about honesty is that there are not consequences for being honest. Or if we do talk about consequences for being honest, there are rewards that follow for being honest as well. And at least in a lot of the ways that, like, we teach kids how to be honest, like the parables we tell kids of, like, oh yes, I was given a wrong score on a test, and then it turned out my teacher was so happy that I was honest about it that she let me keep the grade or whatever. And I think that, like, thinking about the constraints that, like, enslavement gives, like, honesty no longer becomes a priority in terms of one's own self. Honesty doesn't provide life And so like you have to sacrifice honesty in order to give life. And like, because there are extreme consequences for being honest if that honesty can put your life at risk. And like, I think it almost becomes like a hierarchy of values. Like honesty is a lesser value than like life itself, if that makes sense.
Or even just like survival, right? Like it goes down as you're trying to survive more. And so, but I think at the same time, like it's not quite, it's a lesser value in that sense. But I think in becoming a lesser value in the moment, it becomes like a higher ideal, right? It like lifts it up to this like high end thing where it's like when you can be honest, that's when you have arrived into the like light of something, right? When you're no longer surviving, when you're no longer in the really negative space, now you can be honest. Now you can be fully honest. Which doesn't, I don't know, that doesn't sound quite good for honesty. What we're doing, what we're understanding here, right?
But I think it is kind of good in a way because we can really only be honest when we're in a place where we can trust the people around us. And we kind of see that with Bridge Force starting to come out of their shell here, right? With the discussions, they start having a little bit about their past and they're more joking with each other and they know each other's names and are learning a little bit about each other. Things start coming up and they're more willing to be honest about who they are to each other than they could be when they didn't trust each other. So it is also about like, how can we, if we're the people who are in power over others or who are in a position of responsibility, how do we make it so people can be comfortable enough to tell us the truth, to say, hey, I think that's a bad idea, and no, they're not going to get fired, or they're not going to get a bad grade if they tell us honestly that they don't understand something. How do we set that up? And that's the other half of that, right? How do we be a person who other people can feel comfortable being honest with and know that we won't blow up in their face if they tell us something that's uncomfortable?
I think the biggest part of that is like having a pattern of like responding well to things. Like in my life recently, I've had a situation where people have responded worse than I expected. And I thought, like at the time, based on my prior experiences, that this could have been fine. There wasn't enough context for me to say, like I hadn't had enough interactions to know for sure that, oh, this is going to be fine. This is going to go okay. And so when I assumed, oh, it's going to be okay. And then it wasn't. And so I think you need to have enough interactions with somebody. Like first, like you have to be visiting with them or meeting with them. Like I remember, like if a teacher is meeting with a student, it's not a one-off time when you've only seen the teacher one time or the student one time that's going to give them the confidence that they can be honest with you most of the time. And so it's like establishing a pattern of, hey, maybe you did this a little thing that was a little bit off, but I'm going to respond in a way that shows like I care about why you did that thing more than I care about the fact that you did that thing. It really matters to have previous experiences that can help show how you will respond when something bad happens.
Which is why I really love this like reading of the stew as the space of honesty creation, right? That's the image of the stew and the gathering together, that being that place that they have to return to again and again, and how the chapter ends with everyone coming to the stew. But that doesn't mean they instantly start talking about their old flame Terra, right? It doesn't mean they instantly start sharing about the cult that they grew up in. It doesn't mean they instantly start sharing about the children that were left behind in the mountains when you came down with your brother or cousin. They're cousins, right? Rock and his... No, they're brothers.
It was his cousins.
Okay. But like you don't instantly share all those things after that, but it's like the stew pot becomes the vessel for the creation of those relationships and that connection. But it has to be a physical thing, it can't just be like we're all carrying a bridge together. It has to be something that's fulfilling, that is filling itself, right? That is warm, that is inviting, that is something different that shakes out the normative sense of something. So I really like that thought from the chapter. I think for time's sake, we're gonna skip over. We talked a little about like honesty and truth. So the questions around Syl that I wanted to posit are perhaps not as generative to this conversation as I originally thought when I first went over, thinking through how this conversation would go. And then thinking about the spear, do we want to spend any time with his first spear moment? Here I was thinking about asking, which was the first spear that he picked up? Was it the decision to be a doctor? Was it the staff that he asked to be trained in? Was it an actual spear on the training field?
I think this kind of goes back to the episode that we did on influence, right? It's easy to pin who Kaladin is based on a single moment of like, oh, if he had just decided to do this differently, or if he had never picked up that spear, Kaladin says he might never be who he is. But I don't think that's the case, that there is ever a moment that we can pin who we became to. It's all a series of moments, and you can stop at any time, you know? I do think it's interesting that at this moment when he picks up a spear, he's unable to help being honest about who he is because it's such a part of him. And there's some ways in which it's not possible for Kaladin to lie about who he is because he is someone who is connected to the spear spiritually, right? That is part of like his innate personhood and the core of his identity, and he can't let that go. And so there are some parts of us that we shouldn't necessarily pin to a specific moment, and we can't necessarily hide from other people because they are who we are.
I like that thought of like objects being spiritually connected to us, because what I instantly think of my own spear being would be like a marker board, a whiteboard marker. I cannot teach without a whiteboard marker in my hand, and I cannot even give a really good presentation without, holding a pen like I'm doing right now, and holding something in my hand in that way. And it's like I need a tool to write to be able to do everything else that I need to do. And I love that connection of the idea of an object reveals your honest and true self to other people, which I think is what happened in the chapter with the spear, right? And even if there is like a single spear to connect it to, which he calls it a first spear, but we're calling it more of like spear as in symbol rather than spear as an actual object. I think that's an important insight to think about.
I think that's like one of the reasons why I chose to put blue highlights in my hair. They're not super obvious, and you can't really see them on the video recording anyways, because I deliberately made them not super obvious. They're kind of like hidden under a layer of darker hair, and I dyed the rest of my hair to be darker as opposed to its normal mousy brown. But like, it also felt like a more honest version of myself that I wanted to be, of like, there is not always a way for me to like fully explain my personality or try to like be honest to who I am, but like my hairstyle is honest to who I am in a way that I can't always articulate to other people. And like whether or not that gets me in trouble, like that's like a different story, but like that's there. Like I understand why people get tattoos. I understand why people have these physical like symbols on them, because it is a way of being honest to other people and letting them know, hey, if you're willing to like talk to somebody who looks like this or talk to somebody who like acts like this, then I'm willing to engage with you in good faith. And like, I like it. That is it. Like, that's my object. Like I was trying to think of like, what is my object? It's not a whiteboard marker though, but my hair is my object of like being honest to who I am.
Do you have an object, Liz? You don't have to answer, but I'm just curious.
I don't know. I'll have to think about that.
Maybe we'll come back to that during the Wisdom of the Heralds. So to move on to our sacred reading, method. I wanted to introduce a Cosmere-related method. And I don't know how well this will go, as whenever I introduce a method, it's always like, let's see this out, and then do it different the next time, and then do it different the third time. But I wanted to do one based on the ideals for the Windrunners, because I think by this point in the book, Kaladin's starting to really reveal, those ideals of the Windrunner, which are around protection and around protecting others, protecting yourself, doing things like that. And we are given, by the end of the first arc of the Stormlight Archive, all 5 ideals for the Windrunner. So I thought it'd be interesting to read each of the ideals that Kaladin says and then ask, how have we seen this in this chapter? And for that to be the pulling out of the sacredness of, like, how have we seen protection? And maybe also thinking about connection and protection and honesty. In relation to that could be like a broader thing, but I think individually, like reading out the ideal and then asking ourselves, where do we see this in the chapter? I think would be a good method of connecting sacredly to this chapter. So we're not going to do the first ideal because that's its own sacred reading method. So we're not going to worry about that one. We are always worrying about that one. But for the second ideal, Kaladin says, quote, "I will protect those who cannot protect themselves." So how do we see protection in this chapter?
I think the one that I'm thinking of is food. Like, Kaladin has the resources to provide, like, extra food now that he's gotten the knobweed sap money. And, like, food is a really, really important resource in terms of, like, you do less when you have less food, or, like, less than you need. And he provides that for them and helps Rock to help provide that for them. And that ends up making a huge difference beyond the physical needs, but also the emotional needs that we talked about a little bit earlier.
Also that Kaladin was providing that for them before he got the knobweed sap money. So he was using his food rations to also give food to those people. That's a good one, Liz.
The one I was thinking of is when they're down in the chasms and everybody's kind of grumping about how they've been assigned to chasm duty and reflecting that back to Kaladin, right? Moash is complaining, and then we see Sigzil, who's still not convinced, complaining, and then we have Drahe, who stands up and says, like, leave him alone, at least he tries. And so there's a type of honesty to pushing back, or protection of, like, what he really thinks of Kaladin. And it's easy to not voice that when you hear a lot of other people, complaining about someone. But Drahe stands up and protects Kaladin because Kaladin protected him, right? But that's one that I saw.
All right. The third ideal is, I will protect those I hate. So how is a dislike for someone and, acting on their behalf, even though you dislike them, seen?
I think the apothecaries is the first one I thought of. Like, Kaladin could, he talks and tells the apothecary, like, basically, I could undercut you on this. There are other ways I could, like, ruin things for you because I have this information now. But he ends up being like, all right, fine, I'll just take your Skymark. I'll cover for you, essentially.
Those dang union boss / cartel members. Can't tell which one, but we'll need Dan Wells needs to write a little side story around that. Liz, how about you?
One that I see is at the end when they're doing the stew, right? And Kaladin offers a bowl of it to Gaz as he's walking by, kind of being like, okay, is there anything illegal about this that I can get them in trouble for? And Kaladin, instead of reacting in defensiveness or in hatred, hands him a bowl of stew. And, like, that's a really good impulse that's very hard for Kaladin because he does not react well to authority.
I also wonder how different Gaz's trajectory would be if he had accepted that bowl. Would he be a Windrunner squire instead of a Lightweaver squire? All right, so the fourth ideal, the one where we get our armor, is, I accept that there will be those I cannot protect. So this self-acceptance of failure.
There's that moment of silence-ish that happens when they find the bridgeman in the chasms, where I don't remember exactly like how he handles that situation, but it feels like a moment of like, there's not a lot we can do here, and this is an end that some people chose and an end that I nearly chose myself. That he just kind of has to sit with.
And I'm looking at maybe, this is kind of a stretch, but Kaladin's choice to not directly respond to the people who are criticizing him in the chasm, and instead just do his own thing, pick up the spear, and show his own competence instead of trying to fight a losing battle in convincing people it's not his fault that they're down here and fight for his own reputation. He knows that like that's a failure. And so he lets that go.
And then the final ideal is I will protect myself so that I may continue to protect others. So perhaps thinking about protection of a self-care oriented way, or protection of like Kaladin's own truth.
I mean, I'm going to stick with my same one, right? That Kaladin, instead of reacting to criticism, does something that makes him feel better about himself, which the kata reminds him of like who he is as a person. And it's a way of getting over that rejection that he's experiencing.
I'm thinking of the apothecary again, where Kaladin like stands up for himself enough to say like, there is a way that I could provide knobweed sap to you. Basically, like, don't get me in trouble, because if you do, I won't be able to like help my crew anymore. And he like doesn't fully explain why he's doing it, but he recognizes when to stop pushing back so that he doesn't get in even more trouble, so that his crew is in more trouble. And I think recognizing the boundaries of like where you need to stop pushing back against authority like is really important.
So think about the moment with Gaz when he says that Gaz has to take the fall for them going down to the chasm rather than himself like doing it again. So he's protecting his own reputation there. So these words have been accepted. We're now Windrunners. No, we're not Windrunners. At least I'm not a Windrunner at all. But I think it's a fun learning experience, I think, to think through how the ideals in general weave into the rest of the narrative, right? Even though he's not at that stage yet of full protection.
And it's interesting that, like, even though he has to grow fully into the words, right, he already has them within himself. And so maybe that's another resonance with our theme of honesty, that, like, Kaladin already has all of these things inside him. He's just developing them more. It's not necessarily that he's becoming a different person to fulfill these ideals. He's just becoming more himself in what he already has in him.
I like that vision of capacity, right? That you yourself already have the capacity to do all these things. You just have to awaken that capacity in it. Even though it is like a learning process and you're growing as time goes on, you have that nascent capacity or that embryonic capacity to develop into that thing. All right, so we can now move on to our wisdom of the heralds. First for Liz, have you thought of an object or something that you spiritually connect to?
Man, I have tried to do this throughout my life, and I just haven't connected with anything yet. Like, I'm not into like super fancy pens, although I do like my erasable pens right now. I've tried to be into notebooks, water bottles. No, none of these things. So I don't know if I have an external symbol of myself yet. So maybe that's what I need to do, is think about what makes me feel like more like me, and how can I bring that more with me?
Or maybe you can stay ethereal and spiritual all the way. Do you want to take that as your wisdom of the heralds, or should we? Yep. All right. I'll go with mine then next, which is I think to think a little bit more about the circumstantial honesty in my life, and picking when to reveal things versus just revealing them as time goes on. I'm thinking specifically right now in my classroom whenever I like drop something about my life. So like a few weeks ago, my students found out that I went to BYU for my undergrad, and they were all like, And it's because I had talked about for understanding gender performativity, I use the idea of the beard card as a way of enforcing and punishing gender norms. And so I always mention like, oh, I couldn't grow a beard when I was at my undergrad. And they all cut on to that. And then they all start like, they're like, you went to BYU? And I was like, yeah, but that's all you're going to get from my life now. To go forward. And then like all these other Mormon things start coming out. But I think being a little bit more proactive in my decision around the honesty of that, instead of just like dropping lore, as I call it, being a little bit more connecting it to the growth of the classroom and where the classroom conversation is going is what I kind of want to think about. And in being honest about myself and my history and my past.
I think what I want to focus on is being honest with myself and what I want and what I need, and not just trying to convince myself that I could make it work. I think I like to not like trick myself into thinking I could do something, but I tend to think I have more capacity than I actually have. And I think it would serve me better in the long term to be more honest with what my capacity is and not trying to reach beyond that capacity.
Thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.